Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry. Well, it looks like part 2 of the summer event focuses on the light element. So, as it turns out, it's time for another light adventure spotlight. Last week we looked at Odetta. The new pop star siren works well with her, but due to her lack of innate curse res, she isn't necessarily the easiest unit to pilot for the facility event. So this week we're looking at an adventurer who does pack curse res. Ryozen the Dormant Demon. Old Ryozen is a stalwart monk with a desire for peace and an understanding that all violence does is beget more violence. His kit embodies this philosophy perfectly, and he's one of the tankiest characters in the game. At the same time, Ryozen is an elite fighter with a sharp intuition. It makes you wonder about his younger days, but I guess we'll just have to wait for him to get an alt to discuss his mysterious past. The current Ryozen we have, who's been in the game since launch, is a natural 4-star light element lancer. In wielding a lance, Ryozen has the HP co-ability, which boosts his own HP stat and the HP stats of his entire team by up to 15%. This co-ability is useful for team survival, especially for your more vulnerable ranged teammates. In addition, that HP boost comes on top of Ryozen's already high base HP, which ranks 3rd among all light adventurers. But Ryozen's strength, in stark contrast, is 6th worst. Sometimes a low strength stat can be redeemed by powerful damage dealing skills or strength buffs. But, well, Ryozen's really got none of that. In his case, the low strength stat carries through to low damage, as the other aspects of his kit are equally defensive. That's at his core, and it's hard to escape from it. For example, Ryozen's first skill, Celestial Citadel, buffs team defense by up to 25% for 15 seconds. Celestial Citadel is special in that it's the only initial skill in the game that consistently buffs defense. This gives Ryozen a unique but highly niche spot as a helper unit. As an initial skill, this also charges quicker than any other team defense buff. It's still not exactly fast, it takes 3 full lance combos to charge, but it is faster than everything else in its category. Furthermore, with 100% skill prep, Celestial Citadel can also be used to meme and cheese High Dragon entry Rex team-wide better than almost any other buff. Ryozen won't be a damage-dealing machine on his own, but Celestial Citadel gives him a unique identity to build around. A defense buff by itself is lackluster for the most part, so to maximize Ryozen, you'll want double buff abilities on your team. Double buffs trigger and grant another buff whenever a defense buff is received. With double buffs in play, Ryozen can facilitate strength, healing over time, and energy all off one skill. We'll come back to double buffs in a moment, but let's briefly touch on Lotus Lance, Ryozen's second skill. This barrage attack deals a mediocre 755% total damage and has a longer duration at 2.2 seconds. The one novelty is that Lotus Lance charges soon after Celestial Citadel, since it only costs 500 SP more. This means a small amount of skill haste, 5% or more, can be used to line up both skills after 3 combos. When it comes to abilities, Ryozen's Fortitude once again shines through. Ryozen's first ability is Healing Double Buff. This triggers a fixed amount of healing over time on Ryozen whenever he receives a defense buff, including from his own Celestial Citadel skill. In total, this will heal Ryozen for 15% of his max HP whenever it activates, which is already sizable, and it should activate often. Unlike many adventurers with double buff abilities, Ryozen is entirely self-sufficient since he can activate this within his own kit. Just note that the amount healed is fixed, so recovery potency co-abilities or Wyrmprints won't help. Ryozen's double buff plus defense buff allows him to easily forego a proper healer in most game modes, yet still survive incredibly well. In fact, the combination of healing over time defensive buffs, and the HP co-ability makes him nigh unkillable, and he's even more of a fortress when multiple Ryozen are present on a team. Each one will get an instance of regen whenever any of them cast their Celestial Citadel skill. Ryozen's second ability, by comparison, is fairly mundane, but fine. Curse Res is great for the ongoing facility event, and perhaps it'll be good against High Zodiarch. Otherwise, not much content demands it. That being said, Ryozen is pretty good at healing through other types of afflictions, like poison regardless. Ryozen's final ability, unlockable if he's promoted to a 5-star, is Overdrive Punisher of 8%. This ability is also just okay. Strength is a more universal ability, even with an HP 70% clause. But Overdrive Punisher isn't bad either. The effectiveness varies from boss to boss, and this is obviously excellent against some void enemies like the Raging Manticore who have Fury. Outside of that context, I roughly assume that harder bosses are in overdrive 40% of a quest, they're broken for 10%, and they're normal for about 50%. The presence of Overdrive Punisher does make you consider what combos Ryozen should use. Many units with this mechanic prefer to avoid Force Strikes, intentionally prolonging the overdrive phase. Ryozen's situation is somewhat unique since how to combo with him depends on your build and plan. One possibility is that you're using Ryozen just as an engine for the rest of your units, all of whom are loaded with strength double buff abilities. In a scenario like this, you'd want to focus on spamming Ryozen's S1 as quickly as possible, even if it meant using Force Strikes that could hurt his personal Punisher damage or slow the buildup of his S2. If this is your goal, then 2 combos with added Force Strikes at the end, with 12% skill haste or more, works. But note that you would need an absurd amount of double buff effects on your team to really justify doing this. The second possibility is that you intend for Ryozen to incorporate his second and third skills into his mix for more than just iframes. Perhaps you're relying on buffs on Ryozen himself, and you're counting on his damage-dealing skills. The basic sequence you should use is the same 5-part Lance combo, but I would skip the Force Strike. If you can afford it, you really want at least 5% haste in this rotation as well to line up Ryozen's first and second skills. And that's pretty much it as far as Ryozen's stats, skills, abilities, and combos go. Next, let's take a look at some Ryozen gameplay in action while I discuss build ideas for him and his potential teammates. We'll begin with weapons since that's the easiest equipment to evaluate. As usual, the core 5-star elemental is going to be the best, but the most expensive. In this case, Thunder King's Great Spear gives Ryozen an attack that's superior to his own second skill in terms of damage, albeit slower to actually charge. More importantly, though, is that this weapon gives Ryozen the most stats possible. The cheaper to craft core 4-star elemental is Thunderbolt, which just isn't all that great. It boosts the user's critical rate, but nothing about Ryozen's kit or preferred builds really interacts with this at all. The buff only lasts for 10 seconds, too. I don't think this is worth crafting when the 5-star is as good as it is. For void weapons, Ryozen's pool is also fairly shallow. Shinespore Lance has Light Copy Punisher, and Lonesome Wish has Light Dull Res, but neither of these abilities are needed for current void battles. Next up, let's talk dragons. A lot of light dragons emphasize team utility, and that actually works great on an adventurer with lower personal DPS like Ryozen. The new Popstar Siren is a good example. Her weaker 40% strength aura is at odds with her amazing 20% strength and defense buff skill, which can be used twice. The thing is, Ryozen doesn't care as much about having the best strength aura since his focus is on supporting the team anyway. Cupid is good on him for a similar reason. He may not have the best dragon form or buff skill, but it's still an upgrade for Ryozen considering how weak his human form is. Then there's Gilgamesh, another gem for Ryozen. Ryozen is already insanely resilient, and Gilgamesh gives him another 15% Shadow Res to top things off, while also granting him up to 50% strength. These dragons are especially effective, but none of the light roster is particularly bad for Ryozen either. Since I already ran through almost everyone during last week's spotlight, however, I'll go ahead and move on from light dragons for now. Wyrmprints deserve a little more attention since there's genuinely a lot of silver bullets for Ryozen to use. Dragon and Tamer, for instance, works well on him, even though skill damage isn't his main focus, since it also increases his tanking abilities against shadow foes. This can complement Gilgamesh particularly well. The new Wyrmprint starring Nina, the Bustling Hut, is fairly nice on Ryozen as well if your team lacks a bow unit, since it gives him strength double buff, which he definitely wants, plus enough skill haste to line up his first two skills. Valiant Crown and First Rate Hospitality are the other two fantastic sources of strength double buff for Ryozen, both of which come with another offensive ability. Just be careful, strength double buffs from Wyrmprints are capped at 15%, so you don't get quite as much value as you might expect when pairing prints. The other thing worth noting is that these don't have to go on Ryozen himself. Just by including Ryozen on your team, you should feel more confident putting these prints on your stronger DPS units instead of on him. His defense buffs are team-wide, so they'll still provide the needed support. On the more survival side of things, the Heroes Arrive and A Wish Upon the Yule Tree are two limited-time 5-star prints, both of which carry healing double buff. This means Ryozen would get an extra regen stack every time he casts his Celestial Citadel. The Heroes Arrive has Slayer Strength, making it perfect for wave-based content like the current Facility event. A Wish Upon the Yule Tree adds some passive defense to Ryozen so long as he's healthy, which should be easy for a unit like him to maintain. Once again though, just by having Ryozen in your team comp, you could potentially put these prints on anyone. The final two prints I'll mention are slightly more specific. A Solitary Light is a way to give Ryozen extra shadow res while guarding him from afflictions up to 3 times per quest, as if he wasn't already unstoppable. This could come in handy against future Astral Raid boss or Void Nidhogg. The second print is the Chocolatiers, which lets Ryozen achieve 100% skill prep in a single Wyrmprint slot. This lets him cast Celestial Citadel to start a match, which is the strongest buff to cheese high dragon entry barriers outside of Lowen's. It's even better than Lowen's when you consider Ryozen's co-ability though, and it makes Ryozen a very valuable companion for meme clears with unusual team compositions. And speaking of team comps, well, this is where Ryozen has the potential to excel. Ryozen wants to accompany units with strength double buff in particular, since that one actually matters for damage. The key word here is potential though. Unfortunately, there just aren't that many light units at present who actually have strength double buff. There's Fritz and Irfan, but both of these adventurers are okay, not excellent. They require a lot of investment just to build, and their strength double buff abilities ultimately cap at 8%. Then there's Ryozen himself, who actually makes for the best teammate for other Ryozen within the light pool. It may sound silly, but quadruple Ryozen is absurd to behold. I've tried it out once or twice back during the Fire Emblem event, and although damage is still low, it's super fun to see 8 defense and strength buffs alongside 10 regen buffs, and Ryozen will never die. It's a slow and steady comp, but it can sometimes work. It may end up even working against High Zodiarch if the match goes on long enough. Another interesting use for Ryozen would be off-element alongside powerhouses like Ramona, Summer Celiera, and Wedding Alisan, all of whom have 13% strength double buff in their kits. If those units have 10% strength double buff from a Valiant Crown or First Rate Hospitality Wyrmprint as well, then Ryozen can give them a total 23% strength buff every time he uses his first skill. And if he's also using Popstar Siren, he can grant those units an absurd 43% in strength buffs twice upon shapeshift. For now, the idea is a bit too cute to be practical, especially when Leviathan Alisan and Gala Cleo exist. But if enough strong double buff units were to emerge, well, you can't blame me for dreaming, right? The truth is, sadly, that as far as buff bots go, Alisan and Gala Cleo do have Ryozen beat. The unfortunate reality for him is that they emphasize the stat the game cares about most, strength, and you don't need to jump through extra hoops to make them good. As competition, they also highlight some of Ryozen's flaws. One weakness is that buff time only affects skills, not abilities. So even if he wanted to with a Wyrmprint, Ryozen couldn't extend the duration of strength double buffs received by his teammates. This is in contrast to Alisan, who can dole out her 20% strength buff that lasts for over 20 seconds, even faster than Ryozen can cast his S1. Ultimately, no matter how gimmicky your builds, Ryozen isn't going to top these two for strength buffs. He will surpass them when it comes to team survival, but there's a lack of modes that really necessitate that. Ryozen also has more direct competition in the form of Halloween Alisan and Annalie. Both of these units have 3 attacking skills, skill damage passives, and also provide team utility in the form of strength buffs or the energy mechanic. So, yeah. Unless your plan is purely to outlast and whittle down your foe, Ryozen tends to lag behind these two as well. And it's very unlikely he'd be good in an all-offense mode like the Mercurial Gauntlet either, further reducing his possible use cases. I guess the old man really doesn't want to fight, true to his character. And, well, that's about all I have to say on Ryozen. Unfortunately, Ryozen doesn't have a whole lot to do, despite having a whole lot going on in his kit. He's a fantastic unit if you're bored, feel like trolling, or really are struggling with survival and need a defensive lance in your team comp. His presence can enable team synergies, but the survival synergies like healing double buff tend to be a lot stronger than the offensive ones like strength double buff, which means Ryozen isn't great in any mode that favors fast DPS. Still, there's something charming about a character who so clearly bucks the current meta of Dragalia Lost, which heavily emphasizes damage. Ryozen is a pacifist and a tank, and he's excellent in that role. Astral Raids was an attempt to introduce longer, grindier content, but it's limited by past raid bosses. That means Ryozen only has an elemental advantage against Thanatos and Sabna. As a result, it's hard to suggest investing fully into him unless you're really a memer and a dreamer. As of now, the returns just aren't there for promoting him. As a 4-star though, Ryozen is still a rock-solid team filler. If you're struggling with the Crescendo of Courage event, try throwing him into your light team. You may be surprised with the results. Alright, and that's going to do it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Ryozen, and as always, I'd love to know what you think about him in the comments below. Are there any other uses or combos that might work well with the old man? Do you use him yourself, or did you promote him? I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, everyone, thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.